Festival like this is a beautiful indication of the kind of thing that I truly, truly believe in, and I think makes our society more whole and more pure.
We do not take it for granted that Boulder was chosen as the first North American satellite festival. It's a huge honor we will not forget, and we are enriched because of it. We are indebted to both the local and international people that came together to make that happen, and we hope it's a tradition that continues for decades to come.
Literary festivals like this one build up an environment and an ecosystem to nurture readers and to promote the business of books. They provide an invaluable forum for writers to connect with other creative people.
We sit there peering into those electronic grids in front of our eyes, and it only increases the desire to see the real thing in the flesh. To actually hear an author speak firsthand, to read from their work, to hear the tones of their voice modulate as they read their most treasured passages of prose.
For us, it's special. This was our mothership, and it continues to be. The other editions that we have across the United States are smaller versions, different programming, but smaller versions.
On behalf of JLF Colorado, Festival co-directors Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple, Teamwork Arts, Boulder Public Library, and the City of Boulder, we welcome you to the last session of this year's edition of JLF Colorado. The Life and Death of Democracy. Christophe Jaffrelot, Ajume H. Wingo, Gideon Levy, Makrand R. Paranjape, and Mukulika Banerjee in conversation with Milan Vaishnav. While the notion of democracy had its birth in ancient Greece and gained currency in the 18th century revolutions in France and America, it was in the 20th century that it became a global aspiration. Yet each nation that professes allegiance to democracy has shifting definition of what the concept entails. A distinguished panel of speakers examined the constitutional safeguards as well as the civic attitudes that define the critical parameters of democratic process. Christophe Jaffrelot's recent publications include India's first dictatorship, the emergency 1975 to 1977, the majoritarian state, how Hindu nationalism is changing India, and Dr. Ambedkar and untouchability, analyzing and fighting caste. Ajume Wingo has published widely on liberal democratic philosophy and politics, particularly on institutional building in places where there are non-liberal democratic or illegitimate political institutions. He is the author of Whale Politics in Liberal Democratic States. Gideon Levy is a journalist and author of The Punishment of Gaza. Makrand R. Paranjape is currently director at the Indian Institute of Advanced Study. His latest book is New Perspectives in Indian Sciences and Civilization. Mukulika Banerjee was the inaugural director of the LSE South Asia Center and is associate professor in social anthropology at the London School of Economics. Her books include Why India Votes and the recent completed monograph Cultivating Democracy, Politics and Citizenship in Agrarian India. Milan Vaishnav is a senior fellow and director of the South Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for the International Peace and is the author of When Crime Pays, Money and Muscle in Indian Politics. A crucial conversation on the pulse and vital parameters of democracy around the world. Christophe Jaffrelot. Christophe is the Director of Research at Seri Sciences, Professor of CNRS, Professor of Indian Politics and Sociology at the King's India Institute in London, non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and president of the French Political Science Association. Dr. Jaffrelot's latest book with Pratinav Anil is India's First Dictatorship, The Emergency 1975 to 1977. Ajume Wingo. Ajume is an associate professor of political philosophy, associate director of the Center for Values and Social Policies, and the director of the Law and Philosophy program at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Dr. Wingo attended the University Yaoundé, Cameroon, where he studied law at the Faculty of Law and Economics. He obtained his BA from the University of California, Berkeley, and an MA and PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He did his postdoctoral research at Harvard and Boston universities. He is the author of Whale Politics in Liberal Democratic States and is currently working on a book entitled In the Shade of Power, Democratizing Modern Democracies. Gideon Levy. Gideon is an Israeli journalist and author. Levy writes opinion pieces and a weekly column for the newspaper Haaretz that often focus on the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories. Levy has won prizes for his articles on human rights in the Israeli occupied territories. He is the author of The Punishment of Gaza. Makrand R. Paranjape. Makrand is currently director, Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla. He was educated at St. Stephen's College, Delhi, and the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he got his master's and PhD in English. He has been professor of English at Jawaharlal Nehru University for over 20 of his 40 years as university teacher. He is the author of some 20 and editor of over 24 books, in addition to hundreds of academic papers and popular articles. His latest books include Swami Vivekanand, Hinduism and India's Road to Modernity and New Perspectives in Indian Sciences and Civilization. Paranjape is currently a columnist in Open Magazine, Gulf News, The New Indian Express, and The Print. Mukulika Banerjee. Mukulika is the inaugural director of the LSC South Asia Center and is associate professor in social anthropology at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She has conducted ethnographic research in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Pakistan between 1990 to 1993 and in India since 1998. Her publications include Why India Votes, The Pathan Unarmed, The Sari, and as editor, Muslim Portraits. She is currently completing a monograph entitled Cultivating Democracy based on 15 years of research in rural India. In conversation with Milan Vaishnav. Milan is a senior fellow and director of South Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His primary research focus is the political economy of India, and he is the host of Carnegie's weekly podcast on Indian politics and policy, Grand Tamasha. We are delighted to have Launchura as the podcast partner for this session. All our sessions will be available to view on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. Do follow our handles on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram and be notified of upcoming sessions. Also stay tuned to jlflitfest.org/Colorado for the information about our speakers. In these unusually difficult times, we have struggled to bring you JLF Colorado without charging a registration fee. Please donate as generously as you can to JLF Colorado to ensure a free, seamless, and continuous flow of knowledge. Ladies and gentlemen, now presenting The Life and Death of Democracy. Milan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Suraj, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night to all of my panelists across the world. Let me just jump right into it and try to frame this discussion going forward. You know, every year the US-based NGO Freedom House issues a report on the state of global democracy. And if you look at its most recent 2020 edition, Freedom House finds that, 2019 was the 14th consecutive year of decline in global freedom. According to their data, 64 countries around the world experienced deterioration in their political rights and civil liberties, while just 37 experienced improvements. The interesting twist, I think, if you look around and read the kind of scholarship and commentariat, is that many of the threats to democracy seem to emanate from within. So if you take the scholar Francis Fukuyama, he had a recent piece in the journal American Purpose I just like to quote from to kind of kick off our discussion, in which he writes, quote, "Democracy itself is being challenged by authoritarian states like Russia and China that manipulate or dispense with free and fair elections. But the more insidious threat arises from populists within existing liberal democracies who are using the legitimacy they gain through their electoral mandates to challenge or undermine liberal institutions." Ajume, let me start this conversation by turning to you. You have studied liberal democracy for quite some time. As you stand back and look at the emerging global landscape, what is your assessment of the state of global democracy, and to what extent do you believe that these rather gloomy evaluations are warranted?
Thank you very much, Milan, and I'm honored to be among these wonderful scholars. My assessment, let me start with my assessment, is that democracy is alive, is well, and is thriving around the world. Let me say what I mean by democracy here. And I'm going to go with the classical meaning of democracy, which means rule of the people or rule by the people. The word is Greek in origin. Dem means people, or we can take that to mean of. And the cracy is rule or government. Combined, it means rule of or by the people. Abraham Lincoln defined it succinctly and very simply and clearly. Government of the people, for the people, by the people. In fact, the ancient Athenians took this rule by the people almost literally. And the process of choosing leaders was by lottery, which means anyone and everyone could rule. Back then, even nowadays, the canonical process was by election, is by election, and hence we talk of electoral democracy. That is choosing leaders by a process of election. If this is the case, then democracy is alive, it is well, and is thriving around the world. Nowadays, democracy is a badge of honor that is worn by nearly all countries in the developing world. This brand is wonderful because it can be televised for all to see, and Western powers, they can force a country in the developed world to have an election. Almost all African countries hold parliamentary and presidential elections. Government produced by democracy may be inefficient, may be corrupt, irresponsible, dominated by special interests, incapable of adopting policies demanded by the public. These qualities make such a government undesirable, but they do not make it undemocratic. Multi-party, competitive, open, free, and fair election is all that there is to it. Farid Zakaria is very clear about this. Yet, democracy hasn't delivered peace, prosperity, and happiness for the people of Africa, South America, India, and many countries in the developing world. If anything, it has delivered the reverse. Western governments force democracy into African countries in good faith, and I mean it. They force it in good faith. They wanted to make Africa and many developing countries in their image. Presumably, they wanted African countries to be thriving like them. They want democratic government that protect individuals' natural rights, among which are the right to life, to liberty, happiness, prosperity, free enterprise, and dignity. They also want democratic government to deliver a bunch of freedoms, such as the freedom of speech, freedom of movement, assembly, worship, freedom of love, and more pivotally, the freedom to live one's life one's way, celebrated by the famous American blues singer, Frank Sinatra, in his lyric, "I did it my way." Other good thing they want democratic government to produce is constitutionalism as an intricate, creative, and imaginative system of division of power, checks and balances, the rule of law, impartial judiciary, impartial judges, independent media, independent universities, all to starve dictatorship and ensure the sovereignty of the powerless. These are good things. They are good things. To the extent that Western governments believe in their hearts of hearts, in their minds of minds, that these good things can be delivered by mere electoral democracy. By pure democracy, it means they do not really understand their own source of individual flourishing. The problem is not in democracy. Democracy is fine. The problem lies elsewhere. Let me leave you with this. Democracy in contemporary Western world and its outposts came in care of liberal constitutionalism, while democracy in Africa, Latin America, India, and other developing countries came in care of democracy. It seems that the problem of the 21st century for the developing world is how to get democracy to deliver liberal constitutionalism. This, I will assure you, is an extraordinarily difficult thing to accomplish because, as the saying goes among the people of Nso in Cameroon, who sired me, God created death and death killed God. I will assure you that democracy will kill democracy because there is nothing standing in between the hyper-ambitious democratic leaders and their restless masses. And they may close this intro by saying that I would rather live in a democratic government full of liberal constitutional fences surrounding me, which even an unhinged tyrant or a moron can rule, because sooner or later one will. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ajume, for taking us back all the way to the ancient Greeks and bringing the conversation to the present day. Let me just build on one of your insights and ask Makaran to jump in. Ajume has helped us define democracy in a classical sense. One of the central components, obviously, is the ability of the citizenry to define and choose its leadership. Now, we have just witnessed two very large elections, of course, the US presidential election and a regional election in the North Indian state of Bihar. Regional elections typically don't get much mention around the world, but when you have a state that's over 110 million people, as Bihar is, it seems to me that it's worth talking about. So, Makaran, the question to you is, as you reflect on the two outcomes and the processes underlying these two large elections, how do they help inform your views on the health of global democracy?
Thank you, Milan. It's wonderful to be on this panel. I think that one of the things that these two elections have demonstrated is the vibrancy and viability of global democracies. And, when we use the word democracy, we generally know what it means, but the variety within democracies is so stupendous that you can't sort of tar all democracies with one brush, as it were, or even elevate them in the same fashion. I mean, Turkey is a democracy, so is Russia to some extent, and so are Malaysia, Indonesia, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, several countries in Africa like South Africa, and so on. So there's a huge variety of countries, and then smaller countries where democracy is really, I mean, so much in play that the citizens stand up and vote whether the power line should come through their canton or whether there should be, roofs over a certain height and so forth. So I think one of the things that makes democracies so attractive, so erotic, if I might say so, despite all their fissures and divisions and, how fraught they are, is precisely this inability to contain all of them in one box. And before I come to the US and Bihar, for a moment, I thought of reflecting on the COVID pandemic, and we've seen how an authoritarian country like China supposedly has had less than 5,000 deaths, whereas the United States has had over 200,000 and India over 100,000. Yet I don't know anybody in India or the United States who'd rather live in China or be, governed by a system such as China. So despite the paradox that authoritarian societies seem to take care of pandemics better than messy, democratic, chaotic societies, such authoritarian states and societies are not attractive, really. So what I'm trying to say is that democracy is as much an instinct, it's as much a way of living as it is a set of rules and regulations and, constitutionality, governmentality. I think it's really a way in which people have been used to express themselves, politically, socially, culturally. Now, coming to the United States, the most divided election that I've ever seen. I mean, I thought Trump versus Hillary Clinton was bad enough. I was observing that albeit from a distance. In fact, I was in Brazil when those debates and the voting was going on. So it gave me a very interesting view on it. In fact, I was in the Amazon, in Manaus, which is a very interesting part of the world. And Brazil is also such a vibrant democracy, to give another example. So all these societies, large and small, are, despite their divisions, and people keep complaining, these are all criticism surplus societies. Everybody vents about how bad things are. And yet, nobody would exchange them for authoritarian societies. So the US elections were the most divided that I've ever seen. And yet there's so much peace now that we have a president-elect. And despite Trump going, publicly challenging some of the counts and so forth, I think the transition isn't going to be as fraught as we had expected. Now, coming to Bihar, as you said, it's a very interesting election because for the first time, you've got a party such as Majlis Ittihadul Muslimin winning 5 seats. You've got CPI-ML, Marxist-Leninist Liberation, which is a very far left party, radical, earlier they used to believe in armed struggle and overthrow of the state. They've got 12 seats. It's not CPI-CPM which is winning. So on the one hand, you've got this unexpected fringe that is coming up. And on the other hand, the NDA juggernaut, especially the Modi magic, seems to have continued. I think the constituencies where Modi campaigned were the ones where BJP did really well. And JDU is another paradox. They've lost so many seats. And yet Nitish is the longest serving chief minister of Bihar. Over 14 years today he's been sworn in the 7th time, the 4th time consecutively. So what I'm trying to say really is that despite, all these divisions and threats and criticisms from within, dangers from within, as you mentioned, the report, I think democracies are alive and thriving, and I think they're going to give all these other types of societies a run for the money. In fact, we see that though China is becoming more and more powerful, whenever they ease up regulations, you've got a flight of millionaires and billionaires, a flight of capital, and so on, which shows that those systems aren't all that attractive, even if they seem to be.
Thank you very much, Makarand. Mukulika, let me turn to you next. And we have an overabundance of expertise on India in this panel. So let me just dive a little bit into the Indian experience. For many years, you have been investigating various notions of popular representation in India. I know you have a particular interest in its Republican foundations. I'm wondering, how do you conceptualize India's democratic identity today in the year 2020? And what, if anything, to your mind, has changed in either its form or its function?
Thank you, Milan, for that question. And it's interesting listening to Makaran before me, that the world's population now has to face a choice between death and authoritarianism, or mismanagement of pandemics and lockdowns at 4 hours notice, or authoritarianism. I think we can do better than that, I would hope. It's interesting that the number of books that have come out in the last 12 months on hailing the death of democracy, which is why I suppose we are talking about the life and death of democracy. And as you said, Milan, in your opening remarks, that democracy's death is likely to come from within and from not from military coups, but from electoral authoritarianism or other forms of democratic forms that in fact subvert its essence. So the way I look at it, I think, any democratic form has two aspects to it. There's the institutional democracy and there is democratic culture, right? So you need both institutions and you need culture. Now in India, the trajectory, it's very interesting that India's definition as a country is of a sovereign democratic republic. And this was actually, this had some dispute around it. Initially, the formulation was that it was an independent sovereign republic. And Ambedkar, as we know, chair of the drafting committee of the Indian Constitution and a brilliant lawyer and scholar himself, insisted and pushed back against others and said, no, we must have the words democracy and republic. Now, what does that mean? And I think, all I'll say is really to unpack these two things. So I think when we talk about democracy and assess it, we must also think about the republic. And in the US elections, you'll remember very early on, as it seemed clear very quickly that Trump was not going to accept the electoral verdict, the way journalists immediately commented on it was to say the republic is under threat. So the word republic seems to come up at moments where people feel that even while you have the trappings of a democracy, like an election, if you assault something very fundamental, then the republic is appealed to. So in India, in December, when we had countrywide protests, for instance, against laws that had been passed, the CAA, which a number of people felt were anti-constitutional, unconstitutional, their slogan was reclaim the republic. So the word republic shows up in many ways. So how does one separate these two things? I think under institutional democracy, you get what would be called political democracy, which defines the relationship between citizens and the state. So it's that vertical relationship that you choose your leaders. You can have the values of freedom, equality, justice, one person, one vote, what we would call a bundle of rights and entitlements under the rubric of formal citizenship, based on this principle, as Ajume was saying at the beginning, of political equality. It's a one person, one vote. That's how you see it. But democracy is not just this, as we know. Democracy is also about democratic cultures, about creating both political democracy, but also under democratic cultures, we need economic and social democracy. It's about the relationship between citizens, not just between citizen and the state. And if freedom, equality, and justice are the words in the preamble in the Indian Constitution, at least to define that, the word to define this Republican, and here Republican with a small r, this has nothing to do with the US political party, this is about Republican values, is about horizontal solidarities. And so the word in the Indian Constitution is fraternity, right? So we don't think about fraternity enough. How do you create a society based on fraternity? And in India, this was a real challenge because, of course, India is a deeply divided society by caste, by discrimination on a number of factors. And therefore, the democratic aspiration was actually to reimagine society, not just that political equality, that every person had an equal vote, which was radical enough. I've celebrated Indian elections for many years, but that each vote will also have the same value. And this is what Ambedkar was pushing people to think. So I think what has happened, at the moment in various countries that we are watching is that the one takeaway from the US elections is how utterly in need of reform the electoral system itself is. As some Democrats have said, there are no red states, there are voter suppressed states. There is voter suppression, there is an electoral system that doesn't work, there is gerrymandering. There's lots of different problems with the electoral system itself, which is, there's an institutional failure. And I'll leave Christoph to talk about institutional problems in India. I know that that's what he's been writing about. But what we have seen is really that the republicanism, the need for citizens to remain active citizens, to hold democratic leaders to account, is something that has declined. And therefore, you cannot have real democracy, a flourishing democracy, without that kind of active citizenship. Thanks.
Thank you, Mukika. Christoph, let me turn to you. I think this is a nice segue. The way in which political scientists have conceptualized Indian democracy, particularly in recent years, has been to say that, yes, it's true that when the electoral spotlight is on, the vibrancy of democracy is quite apparent, right? We are seeing record voter turnouts at the national level. We are seeing women, finally, all of these decades later, outpacing men in terms of their rates of voter turnout. We describe elections not as contesting elections in India, but fighting them, right? Because of their hyper-competitive nature. All of that is true, and yet many people believe it's really democracy between elections that is the sore point, where the weaknesses of democratic structures in India seem to be the most apparent. Now, you have written a lot about institutions, about fundamental freedoms. What's your take on this kind of Janus-faced nature of Indian democracy?
Thank you, Milan. And I would like to build indeed on your question as well as on your opening remarks, because I think you made a very important point when you refer to the pervasiveness of populism. And of course, the list of countries with national populist leaders is now very long. Donald Trump may be out, but Erdogan is still around. Bolsonaro is there, and of course Narendra Modi. National populists are, par excellence, authoritarian personalities, because populism is conducive to authoritarianism. Simply because the populist leader claims that he embodies the nation. I am the nation. Recently, Pato Chatterjee wrote a book, I am the people. That's exactly what the populist says. There is no need for an opposition. No, the opposition is redundant. Congress Mukta Bharat is the natural conclusion of a populist discourse. And of course, if you are in the opposition, you are illegitimate, you become anti-national. And therefore, that's exactly what I show in my book on the emergency. Indira Gandhi's discourse vis-a-vis the opposition was exactly the same. You are anti-national, There is no reason why you should be there when I am the people and I embody the people. So the main question for me when you say that is, how does this authoritarianism take shape? And our democracy like India that had some robust institutions, we thought, is turning in this direction. Well, I will use, since you invite me to do some political science, very well-known definitions of very well-known authors. You know, Juan Lins remains the main reference for a definition of what is authoritarianism, and he gives a very simple definition in a book, by the way, published in Boulder in 2000. Well, authoritarianism finds expression in decline of pluralism. It's not totalitarianism. There is some pluralism, but it is limited. How do you limit pluralism? Some governments will do it by making elections illegal or redundant or a farce. So China is certainly not an electoral authoritarian regime. But others retain elections, and in spite of that, make sure that they are, if you want, competitive authoritarian regimes or electoral authoritarian regimes. There is no contradiction there to some extent. And in fact, that's what Andreas Schedler, in a very interesting book on electoral authoritarianism, shows. As he says, you know, the democratic substance of democracy goes in this context because the formation of popular preferences is distorted. There is a distortion. And I'd like to support my claim by referring to precise facts. I think we can't go on with platitudes only. We need to give some concrete elements for fleshing out claims like this one. And I would just list few developments that have made Indian democracy less democratic, so to speak, over the last few years. Well, first of all, something you know very well, Milan, money matters more and more in electoral politics in India. And that makes competition uneven. There is a bias. When you have billions of dollars to saturate the public space, of course, you have an advantage, and this advantage is used most of the time by using social media, by using the media, well, the TV channels in particular. So I just want to give a single figure. The Association for Democratic Reforms, that is a perfectly decent organization, to say the least, declares that 80% of the total income of national parties from unknown sources, and that's a lot, was cornered by BJP, 80%. This income of BJP forms more than 4 times the aggregate of income from unknown sources declared by the other 5 national parties. In which country do you see fair competition at the time of election when the ruling party has 4 times more money than the others? And that is possible because of a law that you know very well, Electoral Bonds Act, making it possible for parties not to declare the sources of their income. And this is a recipe, as Mr. Qureshi, the former Chief Election Commissioner, says, for crony capitalism. So the nexus, you can say, of business and politics is at its best, and this is certainly not an anti-elitist and pro-democratic development. I've mentioned the media, just a couple of figures as well. During the last election, if you look at what Broadcast Audience Research Council, BARC, said about the Hindi channels, only the Hindi channels, only between April 2nd and April 28th, Mr. Narendra Modi was on prime time for 722 hours. Rahul Gandhi for 251 hours. No debate between the two contenders. no press conference worth that name. So the media is not a place where you can challenge, debate. If you don't have debate during an election campaign, when do you have a debate? Third, and more, I would say, more surprisingly, the judiciary that used to be the last bastion for the rule of law has developed a non-confrontationist attitude that found expression in three domains. First, you have this strange development that bills that have no financial dimension are accepted as money bills. How can the Aadhaar bill be a money bill? The implications of Aadhaar bill are so huge for privacy, for individual freedom. There must be a debate. There is no debate when you have a money bill. And that's precisely why the Speaker of the Lok Sabha considered it as a money bill, because you don't need the Rajya Sabha, the upper house, to be consulted. Secondly, you see the Supreme Court of India now waiting for months, if not years, before looking at issues, looking at petitions. The abolition of Article 370 was on August 5, 2019. We are in late or mid-November 2020, and that has not been looked at yet. Same with the CAA. They just sit on the petitions. And last but not least, you see the Collegium of Judges not opposing transfer and appointments of judges anymore. There was a kind of battle after 2014, 2015. They have given up. Last but not least, Parliament. India is supposed to be a parliamentary democracy. Parliament should be key. Parliament should be the place where debates take place. And never before Narendra Modi as an Indian Prime Minister neglecting Parliament so constantly. You know, we've made some calculation with one of my students, and we've come to the conclusion that he spoke 3.6 times a year in Parliament as an average. Atal Bihari Vajpayee used to speak 16.7 times a year as an average in the same 6 years of the government of Atal Bihari Vajpayee. Atal Bihari Vajpayee was a parliamentarian, and Parliament was a place for debates. So now it's not a place for debate, it's not even a place for vote. You know, the last vote that should have taken place on the Farmers Produce Trade and Commerce Bill was passed without a division. And that's, I'm sure you remember, one of the things that made Parliament a kind of battleground during the last parliamentary session. On the top of it, because of the pandemic, question hours were cancelled. So the last time I can remember when question hours were cancelled was during the emergency, precisely, when question hours were suspended. And no question hours mean one-way traffic communication again. You don't have press conference, you don't have debates, you don't have question hours. What's left for deliberation? I thought Mukulika would have spoken about the Election Commission of India, so I'll be happy to do it in the Q&A if you want, but I will not do it now. I have also no time to say anything about the way the RTI Act has been amended. The RTI Act was definitely one of the achievements of the previous government, and it has been largely emptied out from the inside. So the list can be longer, but you see my concern. As Levitsky and Ziblatt says, and as Mukulika has just echoed, democracy doesn't die because of any military coup these days. Democracy dies because gradually institutions are eroded, and the way checks and balances are eroded sometimes reach a point of no return, and this is when authoritarianism becomes the order of the day.
Thank you, Christophe. Let me come to Gideon now to talk about a different part of the world where, in some sense, we are seeing a tremendous amount of political contestation. Gideon, let me ask you about how the democratic balance appears to you sitting in Israel. And I want to motivate it by referring to a book that was published by Noah Feldman on the Arab winter. And Noah's argument is that we all know the tragic outcome of the Arab Spring. That does not disguise its inherent worth. People whose political lives had been determined elsewhere tried and fought, for a brief time succeeded in trying to make politics for themselves. Now, that did not result in the kind of constitutional flourishing that we would have hoped to have seen in the Arab world, but that doesn't mean that the effort didn't matter. So I'm wondering if you could kind of give us a sense of where you think this thrust of Arab democracy lies today.
Thank you, Milan. I think the case study of Israel will give another dimension to the whole discussion about democracy and Israel in the context of the Middle East. Israel is perceived as the only democracy in the Middle East. It is always presented as the presenter of Western values in the Middle East. And indeed, Israel is a democracy for its Jewish citizens, a liberal democracy with all kinds of freedoms and rights. Recently, we talk a lot about Israel's democracy because there are some cracks, because in the list of populistic leaders, you forgot one, and this was obviously Benjamin Netanyahu, our Benjamin Netanyahu. Don't forget him, please, in this respectable list. And after 14 years or 13 years that he's in power, we see the cracks that Christophe just spoke about them right now. But I want to raise another question, another challenge, which is much more deep, which is much deeper. Can Israel be perceived or defined as a democracy when only part of its inhabitants have democracy? Does it exist half a democracy? Does it exist a democracy only for one people who lives under the same government and no democracy for the others? Can we still call it a democracy? And I repeat, for us Israeli, Jewish Israelis, for sure, we really gain all the rights in the world until now, at least until now. I don't take it for granted, but until now, all our freedoms are there. But 20 minutes away from my home, half an hour away from my home, there is a different reality. And this reality is run by the very same Israel. So how can we define a democracy? Israel is maybe the only state in the world which contains three regimes. I don't know another example. You experts maybe know another example of one state with three regimes. So we have this liberal democracy for its Jewish citizens. We have a very discriminative democracy for its Arab or Palestinian citizens. They gain all the former rights, but they are deeply discriminated almost in any field that you can imagine yourself. But that's just part of the picture, because there are another 4.5, almost 5 million people who live under Israel's rule and have no rights whatsoever. Not only they don't have rights, the Palestinians in the occupied territories are maybe, and again, if my colleagues, the experts, can recall another example, I will be happy to hear. The Palestinians who live in the West Bank and Gaza are the only people in the world who are not citizens of any state in the world. Unprecedented. People who have no citizenship whatsoever. So we don't even talk about democracy. We talk even about citizenship, which is even less than democracy. I mean, you can be a citizen of a dictatorship. So we have this third regime of Israel, which, let me say frankly, it is one of the most brutal, totalitarian, violent, aggressive dictatorship in the world today. And I know what I say because the military government or the military governing of the occupied territories is very totalitarian, very brutal, and is a dictatorship. You cannot define it just as a dictatorship. Now, the Israelis like to see themselves as living in this villa in the jungle, as one of our prime ministers defined it once. Yeah, we are the villa, obviously, and all around us, you refer to the Arab Spring or to the Arab winter or summer or spring. We are surrounded by non-democratic nations, and we are this villa which is the lighthouse of justice and equality, surrendered by those dictatorship and primitive peoples. This is obviously one of the biggest lies, because as I can see it, I guess it will be very hard to argue you can't be half pregnant. Either you are pregnant or you are not pregnant. And you can't be half a democracy. Either you are a democracy or you are not a democracy. And the key question is equality. Do all the people under the same rule gain the same rights? If the answer is yes, you are a democracy. If the answer is no, you are not a democracy, and you cannot be perceived in the democracy. I've been today, I just came back now from the Jordan Valley, which is part of the occupied territories. In the Jordan Valley, you can see two villages, one next to the other. One village have all the resources and all the rights, freedom of movement, participating in the elections, freedom of speech, everything. And the village next to it, few hundred meters, don't gain any rights whatsoever. No freedom of movement, no citizenship, no freedom of speech, arrests without trials, you name it. Can we call this a democracy? So my challenge to all of you is, can we, and Israel is a special case. I mean, there are not many examples like this, but the challenge is really not only to judge a regime according to the formalities, and not only to judge a state only according to its relationship toward its citizens, but in cases in which there is a state which rules millions of non-citizens without any rights, can we still call it a democracy? And my answer is obviously, at least about my country, Israel, that this lie, this legend that Israel is a democracy must be challenged once and for all. And my last sentence. For many years, Israel claimed that the occupation is temporary, and therefore it could be defined as a democracy, because there are democracies who have some military occupation out of a war, out of some circumstances, and the idea is that those territories will gain freedom sooner or later. But after 53 years of occupation, nobody can take it seriously anymore that this is temporary. It's not temporary. Israel never had the intention and doesn't have the intention to put an end to the occupation. And if so, Israel cannot be perceived as a democracy until it will declare equal rights for everybody, one person, one vote. And we are very far from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Gideon, very much. So we only have about 15 minutes left, and in the spirit of trying to mix it up and engage all of you in a discussion, let me start by tossing out a question, but then, please, if you could kind of keep your responses short, we'll try to encompass as many different views as we can. Jume, let me go back to where you began. You mounted a very robust defense of the continuing vibrancy of democracy, but you had one interesting line towards the end of your remarks in which you said there are many problems in the world, but including in democratic countries, but the problem is not with democracy. The problem lies elsewhere. And I'm wondering if you could give us an indication of what you think that elsewhere might be.
Wonderful. Thank you. Let me just say of America that what is distinctive about the American system is how undemocratic it is. America is a quasi, almost para-democratic state. It is not purely democratic state. And why? Because of what Mokoita and Macron has put forward. Because, as I said, democracy in the Western world today, I'm talking about modern democracy, started with liberal constitutionalism. And only later on did they adopt democracy. So liberal constitutionalism is very important. In fact, is what Professor Levy is talking about here that is lacking. It is not democracy. So what is lacking is this liberal constitutionalism. America has it very well. There is a view that politics is the greatest reflection on human nature. And the American Constitution is based on a pessimistic view of human nature. And James Madison was one who said, if men were angels, there will be no government will not be necessary. So the French Revolution was based on an optimistic view of human being. Therefore, they pull out the institutions and all the institutions and everything in between so that you have people and the state. So you have a centralized state. That is a bad thing. And in fact, the idea that the United States is not pure democracy is a very good thing indeed. And so what is lacking is this liberal constitutionalism, the guarantee of the right of the minority. Again, going to Professor Levy, the guarantee of the right of the individual, the guarantee of the continuation of your life, even when things are shaky. So to say that America is not doing well democratically is like a kid, you know, who grew up looking at their father as a god, and then later on discover their foible and say, "Oh, you were lying to me." All democracies, they've always been corruption, vote rigging, voter suppression, multiple voting. It might be this time, it has to be overwhelming. It has to be overwhelming to catch the perception of people. But if it is not, it's fine. We are not angels, we are human beings. And as I said, what we need is this liberal constitutionalism, and that's the problem of the 21st century for African democracy, for India, for Israel, as Professor Levy is putting it here.
So, Macron, let me just kind of use this as a bridge to connect to something you talked about, which was, I think, a defense of sort of this, you know, despite a lot of the doom and gloom one might hear, underlying robustness of democratic institutions and practices, both in my own country where I sit right now in the United States, and as well as in yours in India. But I wonder whether or not you think that there is a decoupling going on, that is, the decoupling of electoral institutional democracy from kind of liberalism and liberal constitutionalism, in which once you scratch below the surface, you find that many of the liberal freedoms that both of our countries have enjoyed seem to be dissipating.
Absolutely. But, I've found that some of the most illiberal people are liberals, the most intolerant, the most despotic, the most, should I say, unopen to views that are contrary to theirs. But I want to go back to what Gideon and Christoph said for a moment. I think that the problem is we've got into this enunciatory model of democracy, where we've got these precepts and then we say, oh, this is not democratic, this is not democratic, this is not democratic. So going away from that, I've been trying to emphasize that democracy is an instinct, it's a performative, and it's an energy. And of course, no democracy is perfect. And, I'm not holding a flag for Israel, but I guess one of the difficult choices for Israel is survival, in fact, where, only recently states in the region have begun to accept Israel. UAE, for example, which I think is a very good thing. Speaking of UAE, they've now, passed a new law where cohabitation, consensual cohabitation of non-married people is fine. Now, what I'm trying to say is that when these liberal gestures are made, you see, even in constitutional monarchies and in non-democratic societies, they become more erotic, they become more attractive. Whereas Turkey, which was, I thought earlier, quite an open society, once you've got the Hagia Sophia being turned into a mosque once again, that's sending out a completely different message. So coming to India, I'm very aware of some of the things that people have been talking about, but I think cancel culture and, Shaheen Bagh, where they occupied a place, to me was also not democratic, frankly. But the point is, I agree that institutional decay and decline is a terrible thing, especially, sedition laws, people being locked up. And for me, it's not just the laws, it's the politics, It's the politics that made, Arnab go to jail, because the case that he was booked under was very old, was a couple of years old. They suddenly woke up. So the point is, whether it's Maharashtra or UP, or a friend of mine was thrown into jail for saying something about the Konark temple, you see, in Odisha. Now, for me, that is ridiculous. And if you're a comedian, you make fun of a leader, you go to jail. I think that's terrible. For me, so for me, the way the politicians are dominating every aspect of life, for me, that is dangerous, because Swaraj means that it's the people who are empowered, you see, not politicians. And institutional decline, I saw it in the emergency. I saw what Indira Gandhi did. This is not new. And let's make a distinction between populism and popularity, okay? Look, Modi is popular. He may be populist, but he's also terribly popular, unlike many other so-called populist leaders. And isn't it Laclave who said that populism is a way to garner the energy of the people? It's liberated. Look at Bihar. Lalu Prasad Yadav is in jail, and his son won 75 seats. So you see, India, you have the carnivalesque, which is politics. That is, people love it. And you've got somebody in jail, and yet that family gets 75 seats. And if something happens to this NDA alliance, who knows? He may even come to power. So I think that the internal critique of democracy is very important. I completely support it. We should keep asking these kinds of questions. But I'm completely, against this doom and gloom, because I think that it's an instinct. I think it can right itself. And I think that institutions which have been, corrupted or undermined can turn robust again, depending on the climate, depending on the change that happens. And I'm very upbeat about Indian democracy. I just wanted to mention one little thing. You just look at Indian families, large families, and they'll say, now this is a little bit before COVID, okay, but they're going out to dinner and people say, where do you want to eat? And one bunch says, oh, we want to go to Punjabi. So another one says Chinese. And you know what happens? They vote. So the instinct to vote is so deeply entrenched. People vote on all kinds of little things, you know, I mean, and therefore, I think that, you know, as we come out of the pandemic, I think that free societies, even quasi-democratic societies, the societies which have a semblance of people's power, are going to get more and more attractive. And the winds of change are blowing over the Arab world. And I think that the crisis of Islam that Macron talked about and which got him trolled all over shows us simply that determined minorities are as great a threat to democratic and free societies as are majorities, you know. So I think we have to keep our eyes and ears open, and I think that in the times to come, I think the world is going to make crucial choices where freedom and openness are going to have a premium, and it's not just going to be about safeguarding, you know, livelihoods, but it's also about the choices that people have. And I think democracies give people many more choices than authoritarian societies do. Thank you.
So we have about 5 more minutes. Gideon, let me just come to you before I turn to Muklika and Christoph very quickly, because both the Middle East and Israel have now come up several times. I want to kind of link developments in Israel with the global perspective. You know, many people have argued these past 4 years that the dominance and the presence of Donald Trump has essentially given a kind of green light or created permissive environment for all kinds of populist actors who are willing to engage in nefarious or illiberal activity to flourish. Do you anticipate any change in the developments in Israel or in the Middle East on account of the change in administration and the global environment, thanks to Trump's perhaps temporary, we don't know yet, stepping aside?
We have to separate between wishful thinking and realistic thinking. I don't think that the day that Donald Trump will leave the White House, the next day there will be light shining over the Middle East and over the world, only because Donald Trump left. But as you defined it very well, the presence of Donald Trump in the White House and this kind of leadership or regime had a major influence, I think maybe globally, but for sure in Israel, because it was a rare meeting between two leaders who come more or less from the same school of thought, the same school of feeling themselves as victims of the old system, victims of liberalism, victims of universal values. And here they come on behalf of nationalistic ideas, populistic ideas, both of them with the same victimization. I think that psychologically they share much more than we think. Obviously, Netanyahu is much more educated and sophisticated and knowledgeable than Donald Trump, but still they share many values together. And maybe Modi should be added to this list, because Netanyahu always is so proud of his friend, Prime Minister Modi. Now, once Donald Trump leaves, first of all, let's remember that we are not going to the other pole, Milan. It's not like the liberals, even the leftists, God forbid, are taking over. Biden stands for a conservative left or a conservative liberalism. We didn't go all the way to the other pole. And therefore, I think we will get back maybe to normality. But if we speak about Israel at least, yes, Netanyahu will have to be more careful. But I must remind you that Netanyahu was quite powerful under 8 years of Barack Obama, who couldn't stand him, who was a real liberal. at least it is rhetorics. And Netanyahu did very well, and the occupation did very well, and democracy didn't do so well. So yes, it will be better days, but don't expect a revolution after the 20th of January.
Muklika, Christoph, let me turn to you next, and it'll probably have to be the last word given our timing. Muklika, I'm sure there are many things you want to react to. Let me just plant one thought, which is you have studied voting for much of your adult life, and one of the observations that many people have made, not just about India, but in India as well, is that there seems to be a decoupling of the politics of accountability from people's everyday electoral practice, so that people are voting on very many things, but not necessarily in the kind of retrospective, you see, is the ledger is my standing better than it was 4 years ago, 5 years ago? If so, I vote for the incumbent. If not, I kick them out. What's your sense on some of the issues that we've talked today? And feel free to ignore this question if there are other things that you'd like to talk about in your final minutes.
Thank you. First thing to say is that this is not doom and gloom. I've been celebrating Indian elections and Indian democracy for many years, having studied it closely, and actually called it sacred. People thought voting was a sacred right, but that's when elections were free and fair. And for reasons that Christoph has outlined, they aren't any longer free and fair. Electoral bonds is one. The complete lack of secrecy in our ballots in India is another one. And third, Milan, what you just asked about, the Bihar elections are a very good confirmation of what you've just said. There was a pandemic, there was a lockdown announced with 4 hours notice. The biggest sufferers were migrant laborers, of whom the largest proportion come from Bihar. This wasn't an issue in elections. You would have thought that this would be a time when these kinds of issues politicians are held to account for having brought in a policy that so directly harmed so many lives. Not an issue. China takes off a chunk of India. Soldiers originating from Bihar were killed in a gruesome hand-to-hand combat. It doesn't come up an issue in Bihar elections just a few months later. So the idea that elections would be a report card, that the time where you would have to perform, to show your performance, to ask for the mandate again, that sense of that celebratory elections, as we knew and have seen work from time to time in India, simply is absent. I think there is also in this, that why this doesn't happen is, where are people going to have this debate and discussion? I was talking about democratic cultures. Now, democratic cultures is one crucial element of democratic cultures is you should be able to dissent. You should be able to question. If you're popular, you should be confident in your popularity to take unscripted questions, because why should that in any way diminish your popularity if you let people ask you questions, whether in Parliament or elsewhere? A UP journalist today has been jailed for a social media post for criticizing the Prime Minister. So where in public debate and discussion, if we talk about democracies as where you can question, you can hold to account elected authorities, why is India's press freedom index now at 147 out of 180? What kind of democratic culture is this, where we are basic humanity, people fighting for civil rights, students expressing their dissent are beaten up by the police, thrown in jail, and an 80-plus-year-old priest in prison asks for a straw to drink water because he has Parkinson's and his hands shake so much, and we can't provide a straw to a prisoner in that kind of condition. Forget whether you agree with his politics or not. That basic humanity, what kind of standards do we hold ourselves to as Indians? That is at stake at the moment. Thank you.
Christoph, we're almost towards the end, but let me just ask you a final question. You know, you have studied Indian politics more closely than almost anyone. Your point on the decline of institutions, could I put it more provocatively, which is that, is it a return to the decline of institutions? In other words, you had a dominant party system in which independent institutions were weak. You then had an era of quite robust politics when institutions had more freedom. Are we simply just reverting back to the original mean? And perhaps that is where the equilibrium lies in India?
Well, that would be the pessimistic conclusion, but maybe that's the right one. Certainly, we are back to what was the dominant politics in the late 60s, early 70s. And I would say, of course, still the emergency. Because at that time, you had a clear erosion of institutions. And I don't want to return to the list because each and every institution was under the same kind of pressure. The big difference is, and that will make me conclude by also saying how interesting the comparison with Israel is. The big difference is that behind this decline in institutions, there is an ideology. There is a plan. India is not only a neoliberal democracy anymore. It's what Sami Smoha in Israel says, an ethnic democracy with a minority or minorities which are bound to become second-class citizens. They are de facto second-class citizens. And interestingly, the parallel goes further because all this is in the name of security. So we have the security state rationale making ethnic democracy the only game in town. So it's much more important in the sense that it may be much more perennial to rebuild institutions after such a long period of transformation of the regime, of the rationale of the regime, and of course the transformation of the sociology of the institutions, because appointments of judges, appointments of bureaucrats has completely changed. So if you suggest that we may surmount this phase, we may be back to the 80s of institutional robustness, I'm doubtful about that. I'm very doubtful.
You know, I think there have been so many interesting strands of this discussion on the life and death of democracy. And for me, there are at least 2 or 3 major takeaways. The first is that we all, as democratic citizens, must be incredibly vigilant because the old modes of undermining democracy, of tanks rolling through the street, of a dictator striking down constitutions, is simply not really how democracies die anymore. They die in a process more akin to a death by 1,000 cuts. It is the way in which judges are appointed, the way in which new laws are enacted, circumventing proper procedures. It's the way in which bureaucracies in the so-called deep state are undermined. And so in that sense, it makes the attacks on democracy from within even more insidious. I think the second big takeaway is that elections have become the sine qua non of representative governance around the world. Even illiberal leaders and even most authoritarian leaders feel that they must hold on to some semblance of democratic practice in order to legitimize their own rule. However, electoral contestation and participation cannot be reduced to a democracy. The two are not the same, that the liberal constitutional character of democracy, it is really what has made the 20th century such a remarkable one in many ways. The final takeaway is that this is a contest which is very much underway, that much of the doom and gloom that we hear about democratic backsliding, democratic malaise, democratic misfortunes, takes away in some sense the agencies that voters and individuals, citizens have. And we have seen time and time again, whether it was in India's post-emergency elections, or whether it was in the United States election of 2020, that voters sometimes have the capability, the capacity to surprise, to upset even illiberal leaders' best laid plans. So with that, let me thank you. This has been a fabulous discussion, and thanks all of you for joining. Thank you, everyone. Let me hand it over to Suraj for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Christoph, Ajume, Gideon, Makrand, Mukalika, and Milan for this It's really fascinating conversation. We could have listened to you all forever, but looking at the paucity of time, we had to stop here. But thank you once again for taking out time and being part of JLF Colorado. And thank you all for watching and being a great audience. We encourage you to buy the books of our speakers that are available through Boulder Bookstore within the USA and Full Circle within India. Once again, we would like to thank all our official partners for generously supporting us. We hope you all enjoyed this session and will join us for JLF Houston on November 21st and 22nd to explore our stellar lineup of speakers. Similar to JLF Colorado, JLF Houston will be free and open to all and will be live streamed on our official JLF website for registered participants. The magnitude of programming remains as astonishing as every year, with conversations on subjects like history, mythology, innovation, world culture, and entertainment, among other current and relevant topics. Thank you once again, and see you.
I would call the Jaipur Literature Festival a living library, or perhaps even a library of life. Do join us as we share the excitement of ideas and of debate and dialogue, of the adventures of science, of the joys of poetry and music, the consolations of philosophy, the essence of literature and of life.
So much about the festival in India, the scale of it, the energy of it, and I just love the fact that there is this effort to bring it to other cities in the world.
It's a variety of topics. It's meaningful. I'm just excited. I'm feeling like I've learned a lot to think about, and I appreciate JLF coming here.
Going forward, it would be a very good thing to do for the community to have this event on an annual basis.
I think that when you hear so many different voices and perspectives about the South Asian diaspora and many other issues, you learn that there's a lot of history that you're not taught every day, and I think that that's important to bring in today's world.
I was actually really surprised by the camaraderie I experienced here and the way that people at JLF, both attendees and other panelists, seem to really connect profoundly to literature and care about it.
In 2020, our live version of JLF has been laid to waste because of COVID-19. However, nothing's going to stop us from coming in the way of bringing our writers and speakers to you in Boulder, Colorado, Houston, New York, and Toronto, Canada.
Teamwork Arts, bringing India to the world and the world to India through Indian art and culture for over 30 years. One of Teamwork Arts' signature events, the Z Jaipur Literature Festival, is the world's largest free festival of its kind. With daily interactive sessions, lively debate and dialogue, and international music performances every night, it's no wonder the festival attracts over 500,000 visitors a year. The Jaipur Bookmark, an international B2B event for the publishing industry, happens during the Z Jaipur Literature Festival and sees a confluence of publishers, writers and literary agents. Teamwork Arts, producers of the Z Jaipur Literature Festival, have taken the flavor of the festival to international shores with vibrant events in the UK, Australia and the US. Teamwork Arts takes India's artistic diversity to the world with almost 12 festivals of India across continents in a stunning array in over 40 cities. A feast for the senses, these are spectacles of dance, music, cinema, theatre, literature and so much more. In each of these places, Teamwork Arts' colourful festivals of India are the high points of the annual cultural calendars. Be it Confluence in Australia, India by the Bay in Hong Kong, India by the Nile in Egypt, Iron India in Chicago, Shared History in South Africa, India in the Sunshine City in Zimbabwe, Edinburgh Fringe Festival, Kala Utsavam in Singapore, Sarang in South Korea, festivals in Abu Dhabi, Shanghai, Sweden. The list is dizzying. The Jazz India Circuit is an endeavour by Teamwork Arts to spread the word and sound of jazz across the country. The 2017-18 season, 4 festivals across 3 cities featuring over 25 stellar artists from India and around the world, including Jojo Mayer and Nerve, drummer-singer Jameson Ross and Dave Weckel, who collaborated with the talented Mohini Day. The Mahindra Kabira Festival celebrates the spirit, lyric and verse of the 15th century mystic poet Kabir in his birthplace, the historic city of Varanasi. Kabir's poetry is about inclusiveness. Mahindra Kabira brings to music lovers an unforgettable experience of listening to leading exponents of the classical Banaras Gharana and rich folk traditions of music on the legendary banks of the mighty river Ganges, along with sessions on art and literature, specially curated walks with famous local residents and delectable local cuisine. Sacred celebrates the spiritual through music and its ability to heal. International artists collaborate with world music exponents from India amongst the most incredible desert settings on the banks of the Pushkar Lake. Heritage walks, meditation, talks and workshops are part of this weekend experience. Teamwork Arts so promotes and recognizes the best of Indian theatre through the Mahindra Excellence in Theatre Awards. The Meta Week in Delhi is an enthralling showcase of the 10 best nominated plays shortlisted from numerous entries received from across the country and across languages. The Meta Lifetime Achievement Award has been presented to leading lights of India's theatre industry. For the young and the young at heart, the Ishara International Puppet Theatre Festival brings local and international performances to audiences across several Indian cities. While the Multi-City Kahani Festival features interactive storytelling sessions and workshops championing the power of imagination. Bollywood Love Story, a musical. Our international touring productions such as Bollywood Extravaganza and Flamenco India have sold out shows across Europe, Egypt, Russia and Spain. Expressions International Contemporary Dance Festival showcases Indian and international productions, bringing together several dance genres for Indian audiences. Teamwork Arts, celebrating the arts. For more information, visit www.teamworkarts.com.
I think everywhere I've ever lived, I always looked for the library. They come to the library because they want to be with people.
Corporations are not people in the library. People are people, right? And so being able to come in and participate and learn and control that learning experience is what we offer to the community. And that's a beautiful thing. It can develop into something amazing.
We want them to recognize that they have the agency and the potential to create change and have a voice.
To become what they hope to be, to empower them to realize their aspirations.
No matter who they are, no matter what age they are, no matter what their background or ability is.
We're going to learn together, right?
And you know what? Not just me, because I want to create together, but I think we want to create together.
Give us your knowledge. Give us what you do best. Give us your culture, give us good feedback, give us bad feedback, give us any feedback. Let us grow with you. Just come and ask
too. Ask a librarian. We're all here waiting to help you.
To work together, to collaborate, and to come up with a larger, louder voice as a collective.
We are Boulder together.
We are okay, wait. Somos Boulder juntos.
We are Boulder.
Boulder.
Boulder together.
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 We're bolder together. We're bolder together.
Hello everyone and welcome to Kahani Online, where you discover the magic of storytelling in all its forms.
Very special guest with a very special story.
Please welcome actor and author Soha Ali Khan.
The story that I've chosen is called Someday. Here it is. And it's by Alison McGee and Peter H. Reynolds. It's a story that I've read many times to Inaya.
Everyone, grab a pencil, eraser and a notebook, as we are about to learn how to write short stories.
That's very simple. All you have to remember is 5 points.
Grumpy, we have a special story for you that dates back to the year 1962. Major Shaitan Singh Bhatti and his soldiers.
चीन ने भारत पर हमला बोला था. ये लड़ाई पूरा 1 महीना चली थी.
Our storyteller today is Katrina Zail, all the way from Lithuania in
Europe.
Yes, in Europe. And she's going to tell us about some strange and fascinating mythological creatures.
Today I will introduce you all to Lithuanian mythology. I will show you our modern world full of hidden mythical creatures.
I will narrate to you an episode from one of our oldest epics, the Ramayana.
We'll be waiting to hear from you. Until next time, bye-bye.